For instance, Jewish children were no longer allowed to go to school, whether it was a private or a public school. Jewish businesses that were still functioning were no longer allowed, were closed, were permanently closed. Jewish doctors couldn't practice anymore. Christian doctors weren't allowed to treat Jews. Jews were not allowed to go to a hospital. In other words, a lot of the civil rights that you and I today maybe take for granted were permanently taken away. For 2 weeks, we didn't know where my father and the other men and boys were, and then all of us who had loved ones arrested received a pre-printed postcard from the concentration camp Dachau, which was the first concentration camp the Nazis constructed in Germany. By November 1938, there were several other camps, such as Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, etc. My father came home 4 weeks and a day after his arrest, but he was no longer the father that I knew. He was an old, broken, very sick man. And as I mentioned, Christian doctors weren't allowed to treat Jews anymore, but somehow my mother got word to our family doctor, Dr. Weber. And Dr. Weber literally risked his life because every night, late at night, he came to our home and took care of my father until he was relatively well again. I also want to share with you another side of Dr. Weber because it illustrates that each and every one of us, not only Dr. Weber, but each and every one of us, is capable of doing good things, but is capable also of doing some very bad things. I found out that during World War II, Dr. Weber worked in a concentration camp and did some pretty awful medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. Once my father was relatively well again, the efforts to leave Germany were resumed, but the, thank you, you're being very kind. The efforts to leave Germany were resumed, but the focus changed a bit. Until then, we had hoped to leave as a family unit, but it was now decided that that if one of us has the opportunity to leave, that person will leave. Hopefully, the others can follow soon thereafter. And the opportunity came for me on May 18, 1939. I left on a kinder transport, or children's transport, to England. There were about 500 of us on this transport. The youngest were twins, 6 months old. The oldest were 17, and I was 14 and a half. And we all went to England. Some of us placed in foster homes, others in institutional settings, and the oldest ones went to work. England took in almost 10,000 mostly Jewish children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia in the 9 months preceding World War II, and would have taken more except the war broke out, and that was the end of the kinder transport. It might interest you to know that during the same time that England took in almost 10,000 children, the United States took in 1,000. I remained in written contact with my parents until England declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939, and then you could no longer correspond directly, but you could send 25-word messages through the Red Cross, and that's how we stayed in touch with each other. And then I learned that on October 22nd, 1940, all the Jews from the area of Germany where I come from, southwest Germany, were deported to a camp in what was then Vichy, France. France was already occupied by the Nazis, but the southern part of France sort of seceded from the rest of France, called itself Vichy France, and Vichy France collaborated with the Nazis, and the camps where the Jews from Germany were sent to were located in Vichy France. Hello, Betsy. Perhaps an aberration of the war, but my write to me in England directly. However, they were only allowed to write 1 page per person per week. I could write as much and as often as I wanted to. In the summer of 1942, both my parents, who were by that time in 2 separate camps in Vichy, France, were deported to the concentration camp Auschwitz, as were other family members who survived the camps in France. And none of them have ever been heard from again. I mentioned earlier that my parents tried to leave Germany and were willing to go to any place in the world just to get out. I remember hearing my father saying over and over again, "Nur raus," meaning just let's get out of Germany. But there was one place they were not willing to go to, and that was Palestine. And why was that? Because my parents were anti-Zionists. Let me ask you a question, and don't feel embarrassed if you don't know the answer, but raise your hand if you don't know the answer. You know what Zionism is? Everybody knows? No? You don't. Okay, let me give you a quote. Zionism represents itself as a political movement concerned principally with the establishment of a state in Palestine to be controlled by and for Jews. And Israel became that state in May 1948. And I came to the United States about the same time in May 1948. And I had some really mixed feelings at the time, because on one hand, I was very glad that there was a place for Holocaust survivors to go to, because maybe they couldn't or chose not to go back to the place where they came from. But on the other hand, I remembered my parents' anti-Zionism, and I was afraid that somewhere down the road, no good would come of this. What that may be, I couldn't possibly imagine. But I was new in the United States, new impressions, and new things to learn. And so Israel and Palestine were on the back burner of my interest and remained there. And remained there for a very long time. In 1982, I received what you might call a wake-up call. I heard something about a massacre in 2 refugee camps called Sabra and Shatila, which were located in Lebanon. And the refugees in those camps were Palestinians who fled or were forced to leave in 1948 when Israel became a state. And I needed to find out more about this massacre. Who was responsible for it? It was the Israelis. And who was adversely affected by it? And it was the Palestinians. And so as I learned more about this massacre, I also said I really need to learn more, or need to find out what happened between 1948 and 1982, when I paid little or no attention to that part of the world. And as I learned more and understood more, I became increasingly more upset and disturbed about the policies and practices of the Israeli government and the Israeli military vis-a-vis the Palestinian people and the Palestinian land. And as I learned more and understood more, I began to speak out against those policies and practices and began to speak up publicly. Let me move fast forward to 2003. Every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, since a few days after 9/11, we hold a Linville here in St. Louis, at Linville and Grand, on the steps of the college church. At first it was hoping that the Iraq War wouldn't start, and since it did start in March of 2003, we vigil every Sunday evening. We've now included Afghanistan, and I guess we could almost include Pakistan and Libya, maybe. And a friend of mine, Diane, was standing next to me, and she asked me, have you ever thought about going to Palestine? And I was absolutely shocked and surprised by my answer, which was, yes, I'm going. Wait a minute, what did I just say? I haven't made any plans to go, but maybe subconsciously I was preparing myself to go to Palestine. And so just a couple months later, in December of 2003, my friend Diane, two other women from St. Louis, and I were for the first time in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, or Palestine. When we arrived at the airport, we were to be met by another friend of us here from St. Louis, who teaches at SLU. And he had already been there since October. But we looked for him at the airport. We couldn't find him anywhere. So we called him on the cell phone, and we got his answering service. And we said, Mark, we're at the airport. We looked for you, couldn't find you. We're now going to go on to the place where you arranged for us to stay the first night here. And then we went out the airport and took what's called a service, like a huge taxi. It carries maybe 10 or 12 people. And it leaves when it's full. And while we were standing there waiting, our cell phone rang. We said, oh, it's Mark. And no, at the other end, a strange voice identifying himself by his name and rank in the military, in the Israeli military, said, we have detained Mark. We're interrogating him. Where are you? Where are you going? Can we help you? And we just hung up. Because if they're interrogating and detaining Mark, and we tell them where we are or where we're going, that the same thing's going to happen to us. But we did not come there to be detained or to be interrogated. So this was our welcome to Israel at the Israeli airport. Mark and his taxi driver and another friend, both of them Palestinians, were detained at a checkpoint. And Mark had some really subversive literature in his backpack. He had a UNESCO pamphlet, that's the United Nations educational service, or I'm not sure what it exactly stands for, but it's the United Nations agency. You all might want to check what UNESCO stands for. They were released after 13 hours after being interrogated and physically and emotionally abused. The four of us from St. Louis aligned ourselves with the International Solidarity Movement, or ISM. It's a Palestinian organized movement, a nonviolent resistance movement against the occupation of Palestine, of the West Bank and Gaza. And if you align yourself with ISM, you have to undergo some really rigorous nonviolent resistance training. And it lasts 2, sometimes 3 days. And you hear the word nonviolence, every other word is nonviolence. And you have to make a commitment if you want to participate in ISM's activities. You have to make a commitment that you will, no matter whom you encounter, no matter what situation you encounter, you will always respond non-violently. If you cannot make that commitment, you cannot participate in their activities. And we underwent that training, made that commitment, and our first place that we visited, that we were told to go to, was Jayush, which is a very old village northwest of Jerusalem. Some of the homes in that village are built on old Roman ruins. And we had been traveling all day long, and when we arrived there, we contacted the ISN person who was working long-term in Jayush. And we told him we'd been traveling all day, we're tired,